But let's get started. Thank you all so much for being here today. I'm so excited for this conversation. Before we dive in, I'm going to give us a little context and introduce who I am, just for some context. So my name is Lindsay Preston Zappas. I am a local artist, writer, and the founder and editor-in-chief of Contemporary Art Review Los Angeles, or Carla. Carla is a quarterly magazine and a podcast that covers contemporary art in Los Angeles. And I'll drop a couple links later to our website in the chat, just in case you're not familiar with the magazine. In addition to that, I'm also an arts correspondent for KCRW, where I do a regular on-air segments and produce a newsletter, weekly newsletter called Art Insider. So I'm so thrilled to bring these artists here into this panel today and have a great conversation about materiality and process. But a little bit before we get into that, I want to ground us in why we're here today, as this is kind of a program that's in conjunction with the Venice Family Clinic's Art Walk and Auction. The Venice Family Clinic created these talks as an opportunity for their community of supporters, from collectors and artists, to share and learn about the incredible work that's featured in the auction this year. The art community support of the Venice Art Walk in turn supports the clinic's services, which include mental health services, substance abuse treatment, domestic violence counseling, HIV services, food insecurity. They are just tackling all the things and doing such amazing work. The clinic has also been on the front line of the COVID-19 crisis, providing testing and vaccinations. So personally, I'm super excited to be here in support of the clinic with this talk, because they are offering vital services that really support our community. And I believe we need to support and rally behind these types of organizations to build up systems of care for our city. So a bit of history about the Art Walk and Auction. The Venice Family Clinic Art Walk and Auction was actually founded by artists and volunteers who shared my belief about supporting institutions and programs like this. They really wanted to ensure that no one in their neighborhood would go without healthcare, no matter what their income, insurance, or immigration status. Some of the early artist supporters included John Baldessari, Ed Ruscha, Lita Albuquerque, and this legacy continues today. I'm joined by this new generation of Venice Art Walk participants that include Analia Saban, Andrea Chung, and Alex Olson. So today we're going to be talking about the ways that mark making translates into meaning in their work across painting, collage, and sculpture. And so let me introduce our lovely guests, and then we're just going to dive in to our conversation. So Andrea Chung's work focuses primarily on the island nations of the Indian Ocean and the Caribbean Sea, specifically how outsiders perceive this fantastic reality in spaces deemed as paradise. Chung creates cyanotype prints of non-native species that have proliferated recently in the Caribbean, really destroying the local ecosystem. So the prints really offer these potent allegories for colonialization, and we'll talk more about that in a few minutes. Alex Olson's work considers how we read surfaces, both socially and perceptually. Composed of direct brushwork and common signage, the paintings are often self-evident in their construction, while suggesting a range of potential associations. Olson's visual inspiration comes from a wide range of sources, including fashion, architectural surfaces, facades, and graphic design. And then Analia Saban, her sculptural paintings are the result of her interest in dissecting both the painting process and her works themselves. Saban describes her own method of working as both artistic and scientific, and this is an approach, speaking of Baldessari, that she was inspired by her former instructor, John Baldessari. She has used laser cutters, silicone molds, acrylic, erosive techniques, and recent work really delves into painting history by bringing it into the present and focusing on new technologies and kind of connecting those lineages. Okay, last order of housekeeping before we dive in. I want to mention that we are going to be using the Q&A function at the bottom of the Zoom for today's panel. So if at any point you want to drop a question into the Q&A, please use that rather than the chat, and we will make sure to get to some of those either during the chat or definitely at the end. We're going to have a Q&A session then. Okay, let's get going. So happy to talk with the three of you. I was really excited to kind of pair all of your work. The Venice Family Clinic sort of approached me as like, who do you want to talk with? And so it's really an open field of kind of pairing different artists together. And I thought the three of your work shared this really interesting synergy in terms of materiality, mark making process. So I'm looking forward to our conversation. And it kind of comes through very differently for each of you. So maybe we can, start with Alex. I think mark making, it almost becomes a symbol in your work, like brushstrokes themselves become these things that are repeated and recognizable, like similarly how you loop in language or cursive or other repeated symbols, and then the brushstrokes themselves and like the marks you use, this very specific kind of drip that you do that kind of looks like a page tear. And I was just curious if you could talk about how like the paint itself, like those moves and the marks really become part of this visual language that you're building across your work.
Yeah, absolutely. First of all, thank you for inviting me, and I'm really happy to support the Venice Family Clinic, and excited to talk to Andrea and Analia as well, and you, Lindsay. Yeah, so I tend to be drawn to really obvious mark making, like really indexical strokes, like brush strokes, and just sort of, yeah, just very self-evident marks. And I like it because it both it's like a reveal to the viewer. They have both the means of understanding how the painting is made, and then they can take the time to think about like how these marks are being choreographed towards meaning. And as you noted, my work is about how you read a surface, and I'm really trying to emphasize the process of reading. So I like the control it provides for the viewer to understand both like what are the building blocks of the painting, and then thinking about how do I go about making meaning or categorizing or defining this. So yeah, and then the drip that you mentioned, I call it a glop, and it is
a glop. Yeah, maybe Erin, if you could go to the next artwork. Yeah, you see a little glip glop there.
All those sort of bars are separated by this physical glop of paint. It used to be done with oil paint, but that was really precarious. And so I switched to modeling paste, which is still an acrylic, it's still a paint. And it's meant to, as you say, suggest like a peeling or a ripping away. And for me, that's a means of emphasizing that there's multiple surfaces, like there's a potential for more surfaces underneath these surfaces. And this is just a suggestion of some of them. It also means that the painting's constantly in transition, like it's not a static object. And I really like, that's important for me, is that it's this like constant negotiation, and it's yeah, it's not a fixed entity. Yeah, and then it also just it breaks down the reading of it as a screen, and it projects into the sort of the real, into the world. And I like that sort of disruption too.
Yeah.
So that's a little bit about.
Yeah, and I mean, I think as I kind of alluded to, also the work kind of builds across itself. Like as you say, this glop like happens again and again, and then it just becomes this regular, kind of to that notion that you just mentioned about the works kind of always evolving, and the fact that they kind of almost form sentences across a series of work or a body of work, and repeated symbols happen again and again.
Yeah, I definitely, I think of, another thing I want to say is I do think of like the brush stroke as like as almost like analogous to like the alphabet, and you can build with it. And so it's like both knowable as it's, individually, but it's more about how it collaborates with other strokes to make, suggest different meanings, but without being, I try to avoid having things become completely nameable, like they're knowable, but they're not nameable, or locked into a fixed name.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I think something that I always find so interesting about paint. I'm not a painter, so I was just think when like painters have to contend with the history of painting and the fact that and I think Analia, you might have all of you probably have something to say on that, but I think you know, then kind of subverting the marks themselves into things that also have this, again, like loaded history. Every time you put brush to canvas, you're like carrying the weight of every painting that came before, and then to kind of subvert those into patterning and kind of these like repeated symbols is really fascinating.
Thanks. Yeah, no, I mean, paintings, it's a language, and so you can choose yeah, how you want to use it, you know, like there's such a
Right.
range. It's like an endless range of references or yeah, just touchstones to build off of.
Yeah, totally. And I feel, yeah, the work kind of, it loops in all these different eras too. Like there's like Cy Twombly moments, and then there's like 90s carpeting and like all these different kind of eras and influences that are so surprising and fascinating. Or like this one with almost like a digital field of this kind of gradient, the purple gradient in the center.
Yeah, it's a lot of mixed messaging. Like,
Yeah.
it's again trying to not be, it's trying to be a bit anachronistic and open to like, yeah, there's like suggested readings, but again, I'm trying to not land too firmly in a coherent nameable place. And so it's also building a lot of like compare contrast and contradictions, and even thinking about making like hypocritical paintings at times.
What do you mean by that?
What do I mean? I mean things that contradict themselves. Like they might sort of suggest one way of going, but then like how it's compared or whatever it's put up against undoes it.
Right.
That,
Right.
yeah, sorry, that's really abstract and vague, but
no, I know what you mean though. I love that. You're like undermining your own logic, which is really interesting.
It's about like proposing logics to the viewer and then having them kind of, it's like not choose your own adventure, but it's like it's a little more coordinated than that, but it is like yeah, it's like setting up logics for the viewer to follow and then kind of start creating their own logics from it. Or like you can break down, basically it's like a breakdown of a logic and then a reassembly.
Right. That the viewer is like a active participant with
Hopefully. I mean, it's really supposed to be like emphasizing the experience of doing just that, like deciphering and choosing.
Right.
And also playing with the desire to want to lock down and trying to kind of avoid having that happen.
Right. Yeah, right. Like keep the open-ended going across the viewer's perception, across the bodies of work, across the exhibition. Yeah, definitely. And then Analia, maybe we can turn to you. I mentioned history of painting, which I feel like your work is like deeply invested in. But also research and like how your research then informs your mark making. Oh, there you are. I couldn't see you on my screen. And, you know, I pulled in this piece into the presentation because I think it's such an interesting touchstone on this exact thing of kind of looking over this like vast history of paint production and what that looks like. And this is titled From King Tut to Judy Chicago. So for this piece, you worked with the Getty Research Institute, right? To use these like extreme microscopic images of paint slabs. Can you tell us about this work and kind of how history informs your mark making?
Sure, and well, same. Thank you for including me in such a nice context and for such a good cause as the Venice Family Clinic. But this work in particular, you're right. I did it as part of I was a resident at the Getty Research Institute for a year, which was one of the most rewarding experiences of my career. And I just learned a lot. And I've been going to the Research Institute for like, I don't know, like almost 20 years now. It's crazy, and it's probably one of the the gifts we have in LA as a place that, you know, whenever I feel like a bit down on ideas or something, I can always go there and feed my brain. So this piece in particular, I had a little more access as a resident, and I was able to look at the Conservation Institute too. And, you know, it's very tough to navigate because, of course, a lot of like private information, and, you know, they have to, you know, high levels of security and so on. But I finally got access to the computer files, and I saw this folder with all these cross sections of paint. Basically what they do is they, if they're trying to fix a painting, they will take a little particle from any place of the painting. I mean, it's kind of crazy to think about that they could actually like extract it, or maybe if they are lucky, the particle is already kind of falling because that's why they are fixing the painting. So it's like, it's really like, I mean, you can think of it as archaeology because they have the big painting, they take a little particle from it, then they sand the edge with like, this is all like at the very microscopic level. They sand the edge of the particle and then they put it sideways under the microscope to see all the different layers that make the painting. So you can see, for instance, and then, you know, at first you're like, okay, what am I looking at? I mean, like, what is this, right? It's weird. It's like bacon or something. But then in a way it is like bacon, if you think about it, because different layers, you know, the same way, right? Like you could, if you look at like a few of them, I mean, like the same way as, you know, humans or the ground or the earth or a painting. I mean, we have all these different layers. So the more you look at them at the beginning, it's very abstract, but then as you can see, for instance, I give you an example, many of them have a red layer. So that's, you know, one of the ground, you know, ground layers that you would put before you start doing oil painting on it. And then the more you look at it, you realize the different periods. So the ones that look very chunky, the ones that have like rocks in them, are usually older paintings, like from the Renaissance, that are ground, where the pigment was ground by hand. And then, so therefore you still see like those rocks in the actual paint, versus something that you can see like other ones that are like a lot smoother, like, and very homogeneous. And those are paintings from the 1960s and above, because those are like synthetic pigments that are like very finely ground and like very solid colors. So there are like Warhol paintings. There are a few like solid color, like a solid color green is like a Warhol or a Liechtenstein and so on. So I just found this like so fascinating, because I feel like in any painting, if you take a little particle of it, you kind of understand not just the history of painting, but the history of where we're at in terms of society, materials, industry, availability of materials, and so on. So like you said, I think it is kind of like a key work in my practice.
Definitely. Yeah. And so you have a show that's on view right now in New York at Tanya Banaktar that looks gorgeous. We were just talking about it before the panel. Oh, here's this beautiful piece. And I feel like this is very tied to that work in a really interesting way. So this work is 5,000 Years of Blue, from lapis lazuli to Tesla door. And so that's, can you explain, like, that's the actual rock that this pigment comes from, and then we have all the way over to this Tesla door as this kind of beacon of like modern futurity technology.
Exactly.
I mean, places this color in a very specific time and place within our kind of technological production of the moment.
Exactly. And I feel like if you look at this piece, you realize that 5,000 years is not such a long history. I mean,
right.
Blue has like a very interesting history in that it was like really, really hard to make. I mean, like you can't really find it in nature. So you were only able to find it in like a few caves in Afghanistan where they would like extract the lapis. And then, you know, it was so expensive. I think it was the same price as gold or even more. So that's why they did it. They used it like just a little bit for like, you know, things like a version, like maybe just a small detail or something, where the earth colors were like a lot easier to find and to mix and to paint with. So I find it quite interesting as a history. So I did At the top of the painting, you do see a piece of lapis, and it's the original rock from Afghanistan. And then on the other end, it's the Tesla door. I think car paint is in a way almost the most exciting paint because they are always pushing the definition of paint. And
Right.
you can even see it this year with like new paints, like new polarized cars and so on. They are constantly pushing what paint can do. And then I thought, you know, Tesla was in a way like this type of futuristic car. So it was like, you know, the opposite ends of the spectrum on this one.
Right. I was curious too how that paint is applied. It looks like it's applied with like a kind of industry like blower. What was that?
Yeah, I mean, this piece was actually, it looks easy, but looking back, and I had to involve my team and even like outside consulting, like I did it 3 times to get it right. And it was really tough. But it just because, you know, we were dealing with like the pigment that came from the door. So it was like very limited amount of paint. Like it's not something you could just buy at the store. And I wanted to do like the ready-made paint as a concept also, like, you know, connecting it with like the Duchampian history of art. And so yeah, in the end, it's pretty straightforward. We coat the whole panel, which takes a whole team like doing it because we have to do it very quickly. And then I have the pile of pigment and I just throw it with a brush on top, and then that's it. It settles in place. But yeah, it looks simple, but it took a little while.
No, I believe it. I think maybe we'll go from blue, now that we're talking about histories of blue, over to Andrea and your work with your cyanotypes. Those were lovely weavings, which I don't know if we'll have time to talk about, but so yeah, to talk about your work, Andrea, and your forms and materials, I think, are so linked to your research as well, and kind of come together in really surprising ways. So let's talk with these cyanotypes. And I think you have really interesting, the way you talk about your use of blue is really fascinating as well, and like why you're using cyanotypes, but also this particular fish, this lionfish that, you know, you kind of link to colonial histories. Can you delve into that for us?
Yeah, sure. First, thanks for having me. And Alex, I'm sorry, I thought I was on mute. So you're hearing the circus that is my family in the background.
You're good.
I picked, I picked cyanotype in particular. Actually, Harold Mendez taught me how to make a cyanotype. And, I was just sort of fascinated by the process. And the first time I'd actually seen a cyanotype was when I used to work at the Getty. I saw Anna Atkins' work, and just the fact that it's been used to capture the natural world seemed like a perfect fit. And also, I'm really interested in the history of photography in relationship to the Caribbean and how there is no existing images of slavery there because the invention of photography came after the abolishment of slavery. So I think that we're very much in a world that people want proof of things, and I wanted to create my own narrative. A lot of the images that you see of slavery are paintings, and they're usually of like really jovial slaves dancing with, fancy umbrellas, which is, ridiculous. So I wanted to create my own narrative.
Right.
And I'm also interested in the fact that cyanotypes were used to make blueprints, and I'm interested in the creation of colonialism and the effort and the planning that went into colonizing these spaces. So during my research, I would find blueprints of slave castles all through the Gold Coast.
Wow.
I would find documents on how to build the correct regulated slave ship, how to make manacles, a set of laws on how to beat your slave, what to feed them. So I'm so interested in, I guess, how psychologically crazy you have to be to sit there and plan all of that out.
Right.
So using that material, I'm sort of like trying to reflect on a lot of that.
Wow.
And the lionfish itself, it's an invasive species. It's not native to the Caribbean. It was brought to Florida during like the aquatic trade, and somebody released them, and they populate very quickly. They have no natural predator. in the waters. So the only thing you could do is eat them, really, to bring their numbers down. But they destroy everything.
Hey, Mama.
Hey, I'm in that lecture. Can you talk to me later?
No.
This is what being an art mom is like.
I love it. Hi.
This is what I made all by myself.
That's cool.
Look, everyone, that's gorgeous. Way to go.
So yeah, it just seemed like a perfect metaphor for colonialism. You know, you have these invaders that come and have, you know, tried to kill off a lot of the indigenous people in the lands, you know, restructuring the natural world in a lot of the Caribbean islands. Like a lot of the plants that you see growing there are not native. They're just built to design this idea of the Garden of Eden.
Right, right. And that's what these types of landscapes where you get in like the fish and this environment, but you also talk about the coral bleaching, right? Which is an effect that is happening where the coral is kind of turning white. Yeah, and gosh, this work is so fascinating. It looks like a brain. I love it. But then you're also applying sugar to these surfaces, and that is like a very specific materiality that you're applying to these works. And they kind of, there's like this incrustation that happens, but also that's another kind of link for you for like the colonial histories and the really kind of damaging history of sugar. Can you speak to that as well?
Well, sugar, I've been working with sugar since like 2007. And I have a very personal relationship to it. Most of the Caribbean islands were former sugar colonies.
Right.
My grandmother also died having her second leg amputated due to diabetes and gangrene. So for me, it's both like a historical connection and a personal familial connection. So with this, I was trying to find a way to sort of combine the two bodies of work that I've been making, because they felt separate to me, but they still sort of discuss some of the same subject matters. So I decided to treat the cyanotype the way you would, like if you're making rock candy. So I submerged the cyanotype into a sugar solution, and over the duration of the exhibition, it would start to crystallize and get harder and crust, and then some of it would fall off. And thinking about the corals, you know, thinking a lot about Anthropocene and how like our physical effect on, you know, nature, but corals are a regenerative being. They're like a living animal that if you give them the time, they can regenerate their colony. So I didn't want to just focus so much on the trauma, but also the ability to recreate, to, you know, redevelop the colony if we could just give it the space to do its thing. You know, if we could have divestment of former colonizers in those places, in those countries, you know, how could Haiti, for example, flourish if they were not in debt to France? You know, like things like that. So that's kind of how I sort of explore with these pieces.
Beautiful, beautiful, beautiful. So let's maybe use this work. We'll pivot a little to talk about process and chance. I mean, I think we'll get back to you in a minute, Andrea, and you can maybe expand on that, on kind of how you can't control the way this sugar gets at, like it's fully just like free falling into the process. But we've talked a little bit about some of the research that kind of defines all of your work. But Alex, we'll go back to you. I read in an interview that you like need to make space for yourself to fail, that you fail kind of a lot, or like just I don't mean that, you know what I mean? Like you just give your space enough space to kind of make work that has the opportunity to fail, and then react to those kind of things that occur in the studio, which I think is such a really interesting way to think about production and painting. And, you know, I think Analia too, like we'll go to you in a minute, but your weavings, a lot of your processes use these like computer technologies. You're using a computer assisted loom, but there's still so much chance that can occur. I'm a weaver as well, so I know there's like so much chance that can occur on the loom. So I'm just curious about, in all of your processes, how that openness to chance comes through the process, where you're kind of allowing the materiality of the work to kind of guide you to your next place. And we can start with you, Alex. Feel free to take on that failure comment or not, and like however you want to answer that.
Yeah, no, I have a lot of really bad ideas, and I make I have a lot of paintings go really wrong. And so I like to have more going than I need, just to give myself the room to not make anything too precious and just try things. But usually when I go into a work, there's something I do know that goes down, like there's an architecture that goes down. So for instance, this piece called Performers, it's a diptych. The modeling paste goes down first. And I knew I wanted these things, these pseudo frames or peels that would read somewhat like, framed images on wallpaper. But they could be on top or they were coming out from beneath. That's like all I knew. And then, so there's something that usually goes down. Either it's some kind of scenario I want to set up, or it's a question I want to try to answer through making it, or something like that. But that goes down. And then what happens after that is a surprise generally. Like in this case, the interiors are reminiscent of work I'd done before, of these sort of performative brushstrokes that were evoking portraiture in this very vague way. But and I knew I wanted them in something that read as decorative as wallpaper. But then it becomes just call and response. Like you put something down, you see how it reads. If it's not working, you shift it. And I think it's important to surprise myself in every work, or like have like a learning moment, because I can then give that to the viewer. And personally, if I pre-know something, it's not interesting or it comes out boring, but that's just me. Like, I think I need to really do it to know it, do it, see it to know it. Like I can't think it. And there's also a part of the process that maybe I'll get to later, because you might have a question about works on paper coming up. And so I'll wait, but there's also a works on paper play zone, but I'll get back to that.
Right. Yeah, plays into that process of okay, yeah, we'll get to that. Wonderful. I love that idea of kind of learning through making and just kind of allowing, setting up these loose parameters, and kind of what you talked about earlier of kind of breaking your own rules, or like you set up these kind of loose structures, and then how the work can kind of undermine itself or kind of squeeze into that or not. But again, like the materiality and process kind of is guiding the making. And your hand, like just over years of doing this, I feel like your body also has this muscle memory that is really fascinating to me, how that kind of haptic knowledge kind of feeds into the making as well.
Yeah, I feel like you can't escape yourself. Like it's always,
right.
But I think that's interesting too.
Totally. Analia, do you want to, oh, that's so pretty. Yeah, okay, so here's these weavings. Can you go back to that weaving, Erin? Yeah, so these are in your new show. These are woven angle gradients as weft, and then cadmium red medium. So basically, if people aren't familiar with the process of weaving, there's kind of, maybe you explain it, Analia. There's like dry.
No, I was happy to hear the explanation.
Because I'm not familiar with the computer stuff as well. So tell us how this is made. And then again,
yeah, I mean, it's funny because we're like doing it right now. So since maybe instead of talking, I will just show you, like, this is the paint on the table.
Oh my God, that's amazing.
And then I will show you like the loom very quickly, because we're making exactly like a very similar piece. This is our expert weaver. Sorry to put you in the spot. But like, this is Michelle Flores, and she's actually like adding the paint to the actual, so this is dry paint that goes into, sorry, I can hear it. So this is like dry paint that's going into the weft of the loom. So you see it like happening live. So it's quite exciting. Basically, what I found out early on was that if we were dealing with acrylic paint, basically we were dealing with a polymer, and it's basically a plastic. And I thought, why don't we ask ourselves that question? Like, why are we still even painting on canvas? I mean, what does it mean for the history of paint and materials? So I decided that maybe the paint could actually be away from the canvas, or it could interact with the canvas in a different way. So I did many different examples of that. And then this one in particular was about weaving fabric, weaving the actual canvas and the paint together at the same time. So you got to get a sneak peek.
This is amazing. So the weft is the kind of vertical lines. Is that actually a canvas that's been deconstructed, or is it just a like linen thread that's the same material as the canvas? Or
Yeah, in this case, this is all new thread. I mean, I did do that piece that you showed briefly, which is the painting ball, and maybe we can show it again quickly. But the painting ball, Erin, if you have the slide, the painting ball was one of the first pieces I did, and it was really about deconstructing about the 100 paintings, and then like taking it, you know, unraveling the canvas and then turning it into this like huge ball. And it's really like the foundation, I would say, for my practice, because then from that moment on, I was like, okay, wait, what is a painting? Is it just thread with pigment on it? Can I weave with it? What can I do with it? So I learned a lot from making this piece.
wow, I love that. I love that. Yeah, this is wonderful. And your titling is so beautiful because it like gives you the little ticket you need to kind of understand the making of the work too. Like 48 abstract, 42 landscapes, still lifes, portraits, nude. It's really lovely.
An art collection.
Yeah, sorry, I skipped one. Yeah, anything you want to add to that idea of chance or process, or kind of, because
yeah, I love that. I mean, yeah, definitely that's always, you know, present every day, I would say. I mean, I started talking about failure even without, you know, addressing the failure question, because that's just so natural for me.
Yeah.
But it is part of the process, and in a way, I mean, like, thank God for failure, because that's what allows me to, like, you know, they say you have to fail as, and sometimes I play with the idea of failure, even as subject matter, but they say you have to fail as fast as you can. And I feel like I do embrace that, you know. I do deal with it in a very like, sampling. I try to like not waste materials. So like do my failures like at a small scale,
Yeah.
as opposed to like just going through a, you know, some type of huge painting and throwing everything away. I'm very cautious of that, and I don't want to, I feel like we shouldn't be wasteful when it comes to making art. But at the small scale, I fail on a daily basis.
That's wonderful. And then Andrea, if you want to speak to that idea of like process, and either with the sugar or the cyanotypes, and how you know, you're using the sun, right, to kind of create these images. So if you have anything to add to that kind of idea of like the work being a process that involves trust or failure.
It's all failure. Like, it's all I whenever I talk to students, I'm always telling them to embrace failure, because a lot of the things, like very similar to what Alex was saying, a lot of the things that I've learned how to make have been from the failure. And every time I start a new project, I want to teach myself something new. So I'm going to fail. It's inevitable. I mean, there are so many mistakes in this one piece, but you would never, the thing is, like, no one knows but you.
Yeah.
So as long as you can learn to embrace it and like take the lessons that you've learned from that failure. I always say that whenever I learn how to make something, I want to learn how to destroy it, because there's something that in between of knowing just how close you can get to destruction that's interesting, because then you can kind of tell a story with that. Like the orange part of this one wall, my dog stepped on my cyanotype with baking soda on his foot. I had sprayed it with hydrogen peroxide to bring out the natural blue, to see how blue it was going to be, and he stepped on it, and I freaked out. And if you look closely, you can see a paw print. But then I was like, oh, but this is cool. I got this orange color. I would never have known that I could get this color from it had he not done that. And when I first started making the cyanotypes, I was trying to make everything perfect. I was upset that the paper would buckle. I couldn't get a consistent blue. And then I had a friend who was a curator come in, and she was just like, just embrace that. She's like, it shows the process. You know, and I had to stop thinking about, you know, making like perfection, because there is no perfection. And honestly, I don't like slick work at all. Like I don't like seamless work. I like being able to see the hand that somebody actually made it. So I sort of have to, I don't have a choice but to embrace the failure. And, you know, I don't want to waste materials either. You know, like I just got a roll of paper and it was $700 and that hurts. You know, it hurts to spend that much money. So I have to make the most of the material. You know, if it fails, then let me try to make something out of that failure.
Yeah.
With the sugar, it took me a very long time to get to the point where I felt comfortable. Like I kept trying to preserve the sugar. Like I would make these bottles and I didn't want them to melt. And then after a while, I was just like, I need to let the material do what it's going to do and stop fighting it. So that has become a huge part of my practice is I only work with ephemeral materials now, and I allow the work to have its own life so that for the duration of however long it exists, it will never be the same. So these cyanotypes will eventually fade if they're exposed to light. The sugar is always going to melt. Anytime I reinstall a sugar installation, it's never going to be the same. And I kind of like that. I really enjoy the fact that it's a living piece.
Right.
And, you know, you as a collector, you have to deal with that. You know, either you accept that or not. And if you don't, then, you know, so be it. I don't think that all art needs to last. I think it should be experiential in a lot of ways. So you get to watch this thing age, you know, and I find that to be more interesting.
Absolutely. And there's something so beautiful about, as you were talking before, about like the histories you're calling upon and the lionfish and how the ecosystems are changing with the reefs. And then the work itself is kind of mimicking that through its own aging process and its own cycle of kind of becoming or unbecoming. And I think there's something really beautiful to those parallels.
I definitely didn't plan any of it. Like I had to come to it and just embrace the failure. And you know, it teaches me a lot about the material. Like what can you do with the material? You know, it's endless opportunities with cyanotypes. You can do so much with it. And if I hadn't failed and like ruined so much paper, I wouldn't have learned that lesson. So
Right. That's fabulous. Let's skip over, Erin, to the work in the auction. I just want to pull that up real quick and pivot. And maybe we're like a minute before we go to Q&A. I'm sure we can bleed into that a little bit, but I wanted to see if each of you could just briefly explain a few thoughts, like 30 seconds each, a few thoughts behind the works in the auction. So why don't we start with Analia? So these, again, are live. You can go bid. These works are part of the Venice Family Clinic Art Walk and Auction. So Analia, this is one that you did recently with Gemini gel, right? And the work itself kind of mimics the process of creating an archival print and numbering. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, so very quickly, but I love working with Gemini. I've been working with them for a really long time, and you know, it's way more than the practice of printmaking. It's part of sharing a studio with, you know, a legacy of incredible artists that have printed there. So, and I always wonder, like, what is printmaking? Like, why? I mean, a lot of, you know, as you have seen, a lot of my work is about asking questions. What is paint? What's the history of painting? In this case, it's like, what is printmaking? Like, why do we do it? And like, how does an object get to be reproduced, let's say 100 times, an object that gets reproduced only one time? So I kind of love this kind of idea. And then the fact that, you know, then once you have like a pile of prints, like, which one do you get? And it's like, some people want the first one, some people want the second one, which in a way it's funny because the numbering doesn't matter at all. Like, because once they are printed, sometimes they shuffle them all together and then they number them and then they curate them and so on. But I love the whole process of the making of a print and the idea that once you have this pile, there is that one that you are going to get. And so
can you go forward a couple slides to that like red arrow? There it is. Yeah.
So the print is all the same, of course, because it is a print. It's intaglio, so very traditional way of printing with the copper plate. And then it's an edition of 100. And then each one, I wrote the arrow to signal which one is the one I'm signing. So I forgot which number this is, but it's basically that one. And so that's the print. That's that's the work.
It's really great. I mean, it's like really playful and cheeky too, which I love. So that's a hand. I didn't know if the dots or the arrows were printed, but you're just drawing directly on the print.
Exactly. So each one is slightly different because you are getting that one. So,
Yeah.
and it's called this one.
This one. I love
The
it.
title of the piece.
That's wonderful. Let's go back up to Alex's work on paper. I did have a work on paper question for you. So yeah, this work was also included in a recent gallery show at Felton Gallery. And the write-up for the exhibition kind of talked about your relationship to works on paper as like not quite studies, but like they're this space that are really free of judgment. Yeah, can you talk about this and kind of maybe look back on how you use paper in your process? And reminder to everyone, Q&A is open. I don't see any questions, but we'll just keep chatting, but feel free to drop in there if you have a question.
Yeah, so I make these works on paper, and basically I have all this gessoed paper on the ground. They're kind of like leftovers from modeling paste and trying, like they're, yeah, just these pieces of paper I have on the ground, and I test out marks and ideas, and they're really like play zones, and there's no orientation when they're on the ground, and they get flipped over and they get built, and they gather information from multiple paintings. So I consider them like the diaries of the paintings, and they're never studies. They're never like a one-to-one. So this particular one, I was trying to work out this like wallpaper idea, and I didn't want it to be like nameable. Like I was like wanting it to be pseudo floral but not floral. I wanted it to be pseudo calligraphic but not that, and so trying to find this in between space. And so I was just testing out like marks and colors and prints, and this one is more minimal. Like some of them get really like paint heavy, and they're on their own timeline, meaning like I don't make them for shows. They kind of come out whenever they want to. And sometimes they're interesting, and if they are like interesting in their own right, I'll pick an orientation and a side and clean them up a little and release them. But the majority of them get retired, and I have boxes of like retired drawings, and they never get thrown out because they're the diaries. Like I want to keep them. But anyway, so they help me. I couldn't make the paintings without them, but they're not studies. They're their own thing.
Yeah, I love it. Yeah, so if you want to own a page of Alex's diary, go
diary.
Good. I love it. And then let's go to Andrea's piece, which is this beautiful work that we discussed a little bit about the lionfish. But I don't know if there's anything else you wanted to add about this specific one, or I have a question I could ask you as well, but.
This is actually one of the first ones I ever made. And just sort of seeing what I could do with the negatives. I make my own negatives. And again, I had a mistake that happened that one of my negatives got stuck to another negative. And when you overlap the negatives, you get a negative on the paper. And, you know, that's something that I would have never figured out if it hadn't accidentally got stuck on there with tape. So where you see the overlapping of the fins, that's all just sort of like discovery of what happens when you overlap the negatives. So just playing, really, just playing around. But yeah, these were just the earlier ones that just informed me on how to adequately use a negative, or what would happen if things got overlapped. And I think I started to embrace the warping of the paper here because it is one of the earlier ones, but
Right. And I was curious to ask you too, because we've seen images of your work kind of installed in these installation spaces, and there's these landscapes that kind of build across them. Just how you think about one print in relationship to the series, and kind of going to what Analia was just talking, and Alex, like what both of you were talking about, just kind of iterating on paper. But I'm just curious of that kind of idea, like this single one versus all the ones, and like how they kind of mash up, or how you think of them as individual works.
Well, initially when I was making these, I thought that I was just like, I think I want to make something in a corner. Because it's the largest installation I've ever made. And I've been trying to push myself to think a little bit bigger, which is very hard for me. And it started off as a corner, and then I was like, maybe it should be a little bit bigger. And then I finished that, and then I was like, nah, it needs to be the whole room.
Mm,
And I wanted it to be like an immersive feeling, so that when you go in the space, you feel like you're in the water. But I intentionally designed each print to be its own piece,
yeah.
so that no matter how you disassembled it or rearranged it, you could have different compositions based on how I arranged the negatives. So some of them, like, obviously there's a part of the fish, like the head, if you look all the way to the left, there's another frame or cell that has the head of that fish. So I tried to be able to break it up into maybe a composition of one cell versus a composition of like 4 together, just to see how it changes, in the space, and how the viewer relates to it based on something being small versus something being completely immersive. So it was just really experimentation and seeing what I could do.
Yeah, right. And that goes back to that idea you were talking about earlier, Alex, about like thinking across the works as one, or maybe I put those words in your mouth, I'm not sure, but like kind of, thinking across like this thing that connects. And I love that in this work by Andrea, we can like see that like literally happening. But I think maybe can you talk about what kind of mechanisms you use to kind of create that feeling of the work kind of continuing across itself. Yes, you, Alex.
Yes, absolutely. When I make an exhibition, like all the works are in dialogue, and they really like, there's never extra, like it's always, these are the works, and they're really meant to ricochet off each other. And yeah, they're definitely in conversation. Like there was a painting at the way beginning that had these sort of notational drawings, and all those drawings were sketchbook drawings for the paintings in the show that then kind of either got realized or didn't. And so there's usually very direct overlap where the paintings are referencing each other, but then there's, yeah, they'll carry on over into other shows. But within a show, yes, things reference each other. Even though each painting looks very individual, there's nods to one another.
Yeah. Do you want to go up, Erin, to that original image that Alex was discussing? Let's take a look at that, baby.
I'm gonna keep going. Sorry, not to go. This one. So yeah, so like all the
I see. Oh my goodness. Yeah.
sort of the drawings are references. That's like what my sketchbook would look like and how like simplistic they are. But that's carved into the modeling paste. So it has this, like the ground is actually modeling paste, and then I drew into it. So it has this feeling of permanence or engraving. And then the idea of this one was to try to cover that with these different textures. And so the drawing, the engraving runs throughout the whole painting. It goes under these different coverings of textures. And so it was about this sort of attempt to cover a text or a plan or something that's been sort of solidified, but that it's still kind of a pest and comes back to the surface no matter how much like texture you give it. And yeah, that was the idea behind this one. So if you sorry, go to the next slide. Yeah, you can, the next, nope, the angle, there you go. Yeah, you can see like the different attempts at textures to cover it, and some were more successful than others. But if you look at a detail, the engraving still pokes through a bit.
That's so interesting. Yeah, and some of the other works you're really playing with that, where the engravings underneath really come through the entire piece. I'm not sure if we had one of those on the slide, but
I don't think so. I didn't put one in.
But yeah, just playing with, again, those like histories and thinking back to, again, like histories of mark making and carving versus like applying, and then trying to kind of cover. I feel like these are kind of odes to history in a really beautiful way.
Well, it's a playing with material. Like I'm a huge Robert Ryman fan, and there was that like famous quote about it's not what to paint, but how to paint. And so like the how to paint was really important to me, but of course you really can't separate the two. Like the how to paint it is information. So and it matters what the how produces. And so, but I've really spent a lot of time playing with ways of applying paint and what the various means of doing so mean and how they read.
Right. Yeah, maybe let's flip, Erin, to that Weavings by Analia that we kind of skipped over earlier, because I think there might be an interesting connection there in terms of that how and what kind of coming together on these works, where these are these kind of, what are they? They're like microchips that are embedded in different technologies, and then you're weaving with copper to create these weavings. So maybe thinking about what Alex just said in connection to these works in terms of like that how and the what, like why a weaving, why copper, why this image, and like why is this the kind of production method for this particular concept?
Yeah, definitely. And I think we do, Alex and I share this idea of like the structure of things. And I also have this passion for Ryman. So we understand that type of drive. And so these ones in particular, I mean, and I did different ones in terms of like the history of computers. I mean, I feel like this is a time for us to kind of reflect on it, because we are, of course, here today thanks to computers, and it's changing the way we're interacting with one another and so on. And I feel like in this particular case, I wanted to reference the history of the graphic cards in particular. So basically, like I did other ones which were like, it's almost like looking at all the milestones that allowed us to see the world represented now through computers. So basically, like I did a few where, like, you know, it was the computer, the graphic card that was only allowing you to see one color, and then the one that allowed you to see 8 colors, and then 256 colors, and so on, all the way to this one, which is one of the last ones, which is like the, you know, 3D gaming one that allowed us to like see so much. So it is woven in copper. Hold on one second. Hey guys. Sorry. It is woven in copper. And I mean, copper is such an exciting material. I mean, of course, it's basically the way we are communicating now, thanks to copper and connecting all these things. And then the fact that it's also like a filament, and it's something like that, it's not too far away from thread. So
right. Do you feel like can you speak about weaving in particular, and kind of how weaving creates this kind of metaphor with that idea too?
Yeah, exactly. Like looking at the history of weaving, that's something that I think that's why I got interested, because my background was, you know, art. But I mean, before I even studied art, I was always studying computer science and networking and so on. Like I was doing like IBM, like networking classes, like when I was growing up. So, and I did like, at UCLA, I was doing C++, you know, classes while I was doing my MFA. So it's something that I always been interested in, mainly for philosophical reasons and as a way of understanding the world, I think. And so in terms of the loom, I think what like really attracted me to it was this idea that, you know, at the very beginning, it's basically a binary code system of like zeros and ones. I mean, like the thread goes up or down, and that's like it's not too far from pixels in a way.
Yeah.
The resolution when we're designing an image is like 1:1. So if it's like 100 pixels by 100 pixels, that's like 100 threads by 100 threads, and it has so much of that connection. And then the first looms were basically like early ways of recording information, and they use punch cards, which, you know, then they use the same technology for the first IBM computers. So I'm totally into that history. Yeah. I love it.
Love that. That was, yeah, my nerdy weaver to weaver question. Thanks for answering. I think we are basically out of time. I didn't see any Q&A, but that's okay. I just kept chatting away. So obviously, thank you to our lovely panelists. It was so great to speak with all of you, and I hope to keep that going and reconnect in the future. Thank you all for carving the time out of your schedules. Check out these artists, check out their work, check out what they're up to. Analia, as I mentioned, has a show at Tanya Banaktar, New York. Alex has a forthcoming show at Parkview Paul Soto, right? Sometime this year. Yes.
November.
November, question mark? I love it. And Andrea, you maybe have a future show coming up with Tyler Park, yeah?
Yeah, in September.
Love it. Okay, so these are opportunities to see work by these artists. So be sure to keep on their Instagrams or newsletters and get in touch. Let's see, be sure you are viewing the auction, which is live on Artsy, to see work by all these artists. I have a piece in there as well you can check out, and hundreds of other artists. It's on view through the 12th. And then if you've enjoyed the discussion today, you can also watch recordings of 2 other art talks that have already happened that were all really fascinating. And there's one more if you have enjoyed this and want more. On May 11th, there's one more talk moderated by Terry Myers. He'll be speaking to artists Kim Fisher, Jennifer Moon, and Mario Ybarra Jr. about teaching and education and all of their experience as artists in those fields. So you can RSVP on the auction's website. And thank you all so much for being here and joining with us in this conversation. It was a real pleasure to share space with all of you today.